So thank you very much for making time and participating in our October webinar, Building a Disability Inclusive Workplace. As many of you already know, October is Disability Employment Awareness Month, and we have a fantastic speaker today that I'm really excited about. I'm just gonna read her bio real quick because I'm extremely excited. I've followed her work for a very long time. I've listened to lots of her speeches, and she's phenomenal, and you're all in for a great treat today. So Becky Curran Kekula, she is a TEDx speaker, motivational speaker, passionate disability advocate. Becky received her Bachelor of Science in Marketing from Providence College, where she gained a passion for influencing authentic portrayals of people with disabilities in the media and society. Becky currently serves as employment chair of Little People of America. She also a member of the Board of Advisors for the National Center on Disability and Journalism at Arizona State University, Positive Exposure, and Verizon's Disability Advisory Board. She delivered her first TEDx talk in 2014 and her second in 2021. Please be sure to go check them out if you haven't seen them already. Becky was born with, I hope I'll say this right, Becky. Maybe I'll use your help to say that.
Achondroplasia.
Achondroplasia. I should have asked earlier. The most common type of short-limbed dwarfism. She stands 4 feet tall. Both of her parents and older sister are average height. Her parents always taught her to keep a positive outlook no matter how harsh the outside world may be. She grew up participating in sports such as sailing, skiing, soccer, and swimming amongst her average height peers. When people ask her if she likes being a little person, she always has the same answer. I never want to change, but I want the way outside world reacts to my difference to change. If that didn't motivate you, I don't know what will. I'm extremely excited to invite you, Becky, to our space here today and share with us your wisdom. Becky's style is more free-flowing and conversational. So Becky, without further ado, the floor is yours. Welcome to our webinar today.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start off by encouraging anyone who's comfortable to turn on your cameras so then it kind of feels a little bit more like we're in a room together, but totally up to you. But I would love to see as many people as possible. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here talking to all of you. What I usually do is kind of give a little background of my story, and then as we get closer to where I am now in my professional life, I can start to give some practical tips on how to be more inclusive of people with disabilities in the workplace and give a little information on the business case, the fact that it is beneficial for business to be more inclusive of people with disabilities. So as was mentioned in my introduction, I was born into a family where there's no history of dwarfism. When I was first born in a hospital that also had very few patients be born in that hospital with dwarfism previous to when I was born back in 1984, there was very little information that my parents received. And of course, it's already nerve-wracking when you're expecting a child, hoping to bring them home in quote unquote perfect condition. It was their second child. So my sister is average height and 3.5 years older. They really didn't have any hiccups with her. Didn't know what to expect when I was born when they were told that I had dwarfism. There was one doctor in the delivery room who had seen the person with dwarfism be born before. She noticed some of the features that included a larger head. Most babies with my type of dwarfism are in the 99th percentile with their head size, and the shorter arms and legs. There's extra skin that kind of makes it a little more obvious that I'm not going to be average stature. The hospital only had a brochure, really didn't make my parents feel that comfortable, and they were willing to do whatever they could to get their hands on as much research as possible that existed before the internet was an easy place to go. They were advised by the hospital where I was born to go to another hospital to seek out expertise from a geneticist. When they got to the hospital where they were meeting with the geneticist, they checked into the lobby, and the receptionist in the lobby said, follow the signs down the hallway that say birth defects, go in the elevator, hit the button for the floor that says birth defects, then go down the hallway once you get to that floor, and you'll see a sign that says birth defects, and your genetic counselor will be waiting right there for you. This made them feel even more uneasy when they were looking to seek out advice from someone who was supposed to be an expert in genetics, but they're already referencing people who come to them as people with birth defects. My parents had the appointment. I don't even know how well it went, but right after they got home, they sent a letter to the hospital and said, you need to change that sign. We do not need new parents of people with any type of difference to see these signs and feel as uneasy as we did. And fortunately, those signs were changed. And that was kind of just the beginning of my parents advocating on my behalf until I was able to have a voice and advocate on my own behalf as an adult. After about 6 months, my parents were able to find a specialist who specialized in caring for patients with dwarfism in Baltimore, Maryland. I grew up in the Boston area, so we did have to drive 8 hours to get there. And my parents weren't in the best of financial situations. My mom was a teacher. My dad was a self-employed social worker, not really thinking about making trips sometimes twice a year, sometimes once a year to Baltimore, having to pay for the transportation and the hotels, but they were willing to do whatever they could to make it work so they could seek out the best care for me. I ended up having a back brace. I had leg surgery because I was born with bowed legs. And if I didn't straighten out my legs, it could affect the alignment of my body. So I had leg surgery when I was 3, and then again to straighten out my legs once I was finished growing at the age of 13. Throughout my childhood, really the best advice that my parents were given were, don't treat me differently from any other child. Really try to balance the relationship that I could have with my sister, who did not have the medical needs that I did, would require some extra attention spent with me at doctor's appointments, but they needed to also be mindful of spending time with her. So my parents would say, oh, we're going to take her on a mud bath. So it would be something that would be less desirable that I wouldn't want to go to. So they could have that one-on-one time, but it would probably be just going to a restaurant or whatever activity she wanted to have. And it really did lead to us having a very strong relationship now as siblings. I think they almost overcompensated, trying to make sure that she didn't feel left out, even if I required that extra attention. We were 4 years apart in school, so there was that break. Even when I was a freshman in high school, she was a freshman in college. So there was that separation time too, where we weren't ever really in the same school with each other. And that has its pros and cons because a sibling can also be an ally. I had a friend who was actually in my class from preschool to 7th grade, does not have a disability, but it really helped prevent any potential bullying. If anyone asked me if I was bullied as a child in school, I don't recall any specific moments, at least up until that 7th grade year, because I had a friend who was well respected and people liked her, and they knew that if they messed with me, they were messing with her as well. Our parents kind of intentionally planned that behind the scenes, but it felt very organic and seamless. Like, we got excited that we were in the same class every year. And that's really what it's all about, even when it comes to accommodations in the workplace, is someone wants the minimal amount of accommodations that help them feel comfortable and successful on the job. They don't want to stand out. They don't want people to be resentful of any favoritism it may seem that they're getting because of all the time they've been left behind. And so in the classroom setting, I had very few accommodations, but there were some that I needed. It is an assumption sometimes with dwarfism that because of our stature, we may also have other disabilities, and it's very possible that we do. But for me specifically, my disability is strictly physical. A person who stands 4 feet tall as an adult. It is defined as a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act because it is called, the definition is a physical or mental impairment that affects one or more of life's major activities. And the fact that I live in a world that I have to try to reach high things on an everyday basis, the world wasn't quite made for us. So we do fit under the Americans with Disabilities Act, even though you may meet some people with dwarfism who won't identify as having a disability. It is something that was important to me early on in my adult life, professional life, because it's a larger group of people to advocate on behalf of. So it may be someone's personal choice, but on paper, we are defined as a group who has a disability. But when I was talking about kind of the different disabilities that may be assumed, there are some families that may assume that their child needs an IEP for 504 plan. But for me, it was really just a few accommodations like a step stool to reach things in my school, getting from the first to second floor, having a lower railing so I could reach and be safe going up and down the stairs. I preferred not to use an elevator. Sometimes in elevators, the buttons are high and I can't reach them. So that prevents the independence that I want to have. So in that case, the railing on the stairs worked better for me. Moments like even though right now I'm sitting down, if I was sitting next to all of you in a room, most of us would be the same height sitting down because I have an average height torso, just shorter arms and legs. But all of my organs are more compact. So if I were to be sitting in a room with all of you, it may look like all the organs are in the same places, but there's a lot less room for things to get around. And that leads to some potential complications like bladder control or spinal stenosis, which is common with people with achondroplasia, the type of dwarfism I have. I ended up losing my ability to walk in 10th grade. It was right before 10th grade. As I was active in sports every summer from the age of 8 to 18, I was a sailor and I was wearing a wetsuit one day and I thought that maybe it was just on too tight, but it just happened to be the timing where I was having spinal cord compression and it affected my ability to walk. And I immediately needed to have surgery where I had 7 pieces of my lower vertebrae removed. I missed 29 days of school. And that was one of the hardest moments for me because I was so fearful of falling behind. And that was a moment where I was feeling out of control, where I was going to have to take a break from school. It was recommended that I even take the whole school year off, even though I was just needing to be off for 29 days. But one of the important pieces of advice that the doctor gave to my parents when I was 6 months old was try to keep her in the same school system. And even more importantly, try to keep her in the same grade because she's going to constantly be with people who are familiar to her and who she's familiar to. So the moment if I chose to stay back a grade, I'd have to get to know a whole group of people who I hadn't spent my whole educational life with. That's why it was important for me to work as hard as I could, even though I was recovering. And fortunately, I was given the ability to walk again and get back into school. I went from honors classes to college preparatory classes, which some people may say, that's fine, you're still doing okay. But for me, it felt like I was really falling behind. But by senior year, I had applied to 9 colleges and I was in some honors and AP classes to be on track to prep for college. The college that I chose to attend was Providence College in Rhode Island. I was really intrigued about majoring in marketing because I just find marketing fascinating. I've really enjoyed even more in current days, social media and just branding and the importance of products and how they're marketed. And I didn't fully know much about it because it's not something you really learn about in school before college, but I thought I'm going to try it out. And the reason I chose Providence College was I was in the cafeteria when I was going on a tour there, and there was someone who also had dwarfism in the cafeteria. She was a freshman at the time. And I thought this environment has been exposed to at least one other little person. So this is a good sign that they're inclusive, because she wouldn't still be here if they weren't. And I didn't bring this up earlier, but I had mentioned that like most people with dwarfism are born into average height families, 80%. And then there are only 30,000 people with dwarfism in the United States, a few 100,000 in the world. So on an everyday basis, people don't see us. So their perceptions come from what they see in the media. If they've seen a negative portrayal in the media, they're going to be more reactive in a negative way. If they've seen a positive portrayal, they may be curious and willing to have a conversation in a genuine way. And this may also impact parents like my parents who show up at a hospital, they're told their child has dwarfism, and then they immediately look back and think of elves and leprechauns and all of the negative portrayals from the past. And that may affect how they think to raise their child or put their child up for adoption because they don't think they can handle it. So it's really important to make sure that we all present ourselves in a professional manner because it affects how we are treated across all levels of society. And that's when I started to figure out while I was in college that there's something about the media and how it portrays people like me. How can I get a handle on influencing change so then we can see more positive portrayals and it'll affect people's decisions in a more positive way? I had some marketing internships throughout college, not really related to the media because in Providence, there wasn't a ton of opportunity related to the media at that point in time. But I did have an internship at the NBC affiliate, worked in promotions and publicity, kind of got a handle on the news side of things. And then I applied to an ad agency for an internship, and they were an ad agency who was the intermediary between the general public and the movie studios. So they would fill advanced screenings of movies like Happy Feet with families who were in the target audience. So families with young kids, have them show up to the movie, take notes on how people react to the movie before it has a wide release to see if anything needs to be altered. And the way that people treated that experience, it felt like a VIP experience coming to a free movie, being able to provide feedback, really kept convincing me that anything related to entertainment, people are fascinated by and willing to pay attention to. So I continued to try to think, how can I get more integrated into this industry, even though it's a very competitive industry because it seems very glamorous and everyone wants to be a part of it. And one of the biggest decisions I had to make was be in a city where the media and jobs are more prominent in this industry. So I decided that I wanted to move to Los Angeles, California after I graduated college. It wasn't an easy decision, and I also have a very supportive family, but they wanted to make sure that I had a job and a place to live before I decided to go there. I was offered a job to work for another little person who has a management consulting company where she represents actors with disabilities. And I thought it would be a great opportunity. And then I had some friends who offered to let me stay on their couch until I figured out where I wanted to live in the city. So that was enough to get my parents on board. We booked a flight. I booked a one-way. They booked a round trip so they could bring me out there, get me settled. And then once I got to LA, the job fell through. And it was unfortunate because this was a job working for another person with dwarfism. So you think, oh, they would be understanding and they would be supportive, but not in this case. And I actually have yet to meet the lady to this day. But it was a way for me to get out there because I was able to check the box of having a job. My parents weren't thrilled. They, of course, asked if I was ready to come back home every few weeks. But I treated that moment like a full-time job, looking for jobs. I had networked with some people in the Providence area, people who had gone to Providence College, had that connection, and happened to be living out in Los Angeles at the time. Went to coffee meetings, met as many people as possible, got this book called The Hollywood Creative Directory, went through it and wrote physical letters to all these places, really just looking for an entry-level job, nothing too fancy. After all was said and done, I had sent out 1,000 resumes, went on 100 interviews over the course of 4 months. Every single day, I would have up to 4 interviews every single weekday. And I was driving around Los Angeles where traffic was brutal. So there was probably a lot of anxiousness that I had to begin with. But every time I walked in the door in those interviews, I was judged based on my appearance. And of course, nobody was going to say anything because that would get them in a lot of trouble, but body language says a lot. And nobody really asked me the questions that they needed to ask me in order to feel comfortable to have a successful interview. And that's why I'm a huge advocate for being more inclusive in the application to interview, to onboarding, to retention and advancement process, because I had such a miserable experience. I would send emails, thank you letters, emails, wanting feedback, wanting people to tell me. It's very possible that I was just terrible at interviewing, but I had no one to tell me or coach me how to do better because everyone was fearful in my presence, and it was very obvious. So after about 4 months of those interviews and being exhausted, I still wasn't willing to give up, even though I was getting those phone calls from home. Are you ready yet? Are you ready to come back? I ended up going through some temporary placement recruitment agencies. I'm a huge component of those types of companies because you'll have someone who can advocate on your behalf, who can coach you through the interview process. And these people, these companies were specific to jobs in the entertainment industry. And I've never had a desire to be an actor. So this was always strictly behind the scenes. And it was just very, very competitive, just like the other side is too. But these people were willing to send me to a job that I could just start working and prove that I was a hard worker. And I worked at the Hallmark Channel for about a month. It was during the holiday season. So it was really a downtime, but it was still an opportunity to be in a workplace for a month, show that I could do the job. Then I worked at a place called Trailer Park, where they make trailers for movies, kind of around the holiday season. So still very strict to kind of what was going on for the holidays, but it was still a place where I could feel independent and get a paycheck and show up at a job. Then things slowed down after that assignment was done because it was the holidays, and most people in the entertainment industry take 2 weeks off for the holidays. I went back home to Boston to just be with my family for the holidays, but I was fearful of booking that trip because I knew they were going to continue to ask me, do you have a job? What's going to happen? Do you really need to go back? But they made a promise that I could still keep trying as long as I was going to work hard to find that opportunity. Was home back in LA for New Year's and immediately went back through the interview process, interviewed a few more places, then was asked to show up one day. It was January 19th, so 19 days after the new year. I went to a place called Creative Artists Agency, which is a sports and talent agency, one of the largest in Hollywood and in the world. And I was asked to work in the Hispanic marketing department. It was unfortunate that I took French in school. So I did not have Spanish speaking as my skill, but there was something about the lady who ran that department. She was actually the founder of Latina magazine and had been a producer on the movie Spanglish and a few other projects, just a really big subject matter expert when it comes to representation of the Latin American community. And she saw something in me and heard about my story of having so many interviews to get there. She was willing to advocate on my behalf, even though I did not have any experience speaking Spanish to the clients that she served. We brought in someone who could coach me. I could do kind of the administrative tasks to assist this agent, and that other person could really have those conversations when required to be in Spanish. And that was something they easily could have said I wasn't a fit for the job, because truth is I just did not have experience speaking Spanish, but it was someone who saw potential in me. And when there was an opportunity that opened up in the entertainment marketing department, where Spanish speaking was not a main requirement, I was able to get transferred and work on behalf of brands who were really excited to get a presence in the entertainment space. So you take Coca-Cola, they may want to be a sponsor of an award show. And this agency also had so many other departments that would package the things that we would brand for the brands. eBay, they were really big on the theme of winning. So we did a bus tour where two comedians went up and down the state of California, and they would compete in things that one of them could win in. We would do some short films related to a toy like Mattel or Hasbro, and then sometimes they would turn into larger films. These were just all things that corporations were excited about, wanted to be a part of. Harley Davidson, they wanted to make sure that as many celebrities as possible were riding a Harley. If they found a People magazine article and there was someone riding a Triumph or another type of motorcycle, they would want to figure out how we can get them to ride a Harley and be pictured in that magazine with their Harley. There was also risk involved. So Shia LaBeouf, he decided to give the motorcycle that was given to him to his mother. So that was going to prevent Harley from seeing Shia with this motorcycle that they had given him. But people were prepared for that because it was going to come up. It was about 2 years that I worked in the marketing department, and I decided that I wanted to figure out what else was out there, even though marketing was my major and something that really excited me. There was an opportunity to work in the comedy touring department where I could represent comedians and book them in shows all across the country and the world. And I learned just kind of how that whole contract process works and how to properly market comedians. And I was able to use some of the skills I had from the job at the advertising agency, where I could go to a comedy show and write notes on the different comedians and figure out who may be a good fit to be represented by the agency or who was horrible. And sometimes the way that I would judge horrible comedians would be if they pointed me out of the crowd and said disrespectful things. It takes a lot of vulnerability and bravery to show up at those types of places, because especially when people start drinking, they're more likely to say something crazy. But if the comedian says something, a lot of times the audience would react in a upset way as well, kind of protecting me as a human being. And it didn't happen too many times, but it was something that they did not know, that I worked for a major talent agency and could influence the potential future they had if they wanted representation there. After about 4 years of working at the agency, it was a long time that I also kind of made a decision that I did not want to be a talent agent. So I needed to find a different career path anyways, but I wanted to still work in the industry. So I held on to my job for a while because it took so long to get the job in the first place. Most people who are an assistant and want to do a different job will choose to move to another company or another job in a lot shorter of a period of time. So there was a training program if I wanted to be an agent, and it requires you to go back to the mailroom. So basically you get demoted, go to the mailroom, see how you can survive delivering packages all around town, famous people's houses. It also makes you become aware of the key players in the entertainment industry. Long hours, very low pay, just really it's like boot camp to see if you can survive in order to get promoted to the next level. And it really just wasn't an environment that would be inclusive for me. I could show up at someone's house to drop off a package, but what if I can't reach the doorbell or get past the gate? Or what if it was in an unsafe area? There were a lot of things that needed to be considered that just weren't considered at that point in time. I was the only little person, or really only person with a visible disability, who had worked at the agency up until that point. And that even went with representation and who they decided to represent. Luckily, it's come a long way now, but people started asking me, because I did stand out of the crowd after those 4 years of being there, kind of getting my feet wet and proving that I'm a hard worker. They wanted to know, high up people at the agency wanted to know, what is it that you're passionate about? And I told them exactly what I was passionate about: changing what we see in the media, because it affects how people like me are treated in society. And they were able to give me a platform where there was a screening room, because there were screenings that were hosted at the agency often, to host a conversation. It was a panel conversation of people with disabilities and without disabilities working in front of and behind the scenes in the entertainment industry, having conversation about this very thing, the representation of disability in the media. And from that, I built a Twitter and Facebook page where I just share positive stories that I see when I Google the word disability, so other people in the world can see positive representation of things that are possible, even if they think it's not. For example, when someone acquires a disability, most people acquire a disability later in life, and maybe they're afraid that they can't participate in their favorite sports or activities, but it is possible. It just may be in a different way. And from that experience, starting to have some of those conversations, a lot of people who were mentoring me had said that maybe casting was a good opportunity for me. I had a little bit of experience working in casting during one of the summers of college, but this was more, it would be a full-time job where I would help make the decision on who we see in TV and in movies. So I then was offered a job to work at CBS Television Studios in the television casting department. Basically, our department had to approve every speaking role that takes place on any CBS show. And before that, right before I left the agency, I had a conversation with one of the partners at the agency, and he told me that he had a father who was a paraplegic. He had no legs, and this partner had lived with his father for 8 years, taking care of him. And as someone with a physical disability, people feel comfortable sharing those types of stories with me. But I followed up with the question of, does anyone else at this agency know that story? And this big partner represented high-profile clients like George Clooney, Clint Eastwood, Robert Redford, very high-profile type person with high-profile relationships. And there could have been stories about his father if he were willing to talk about it. And that's one of the most important things that we try to advise companies on now. Try to get your highest level people to talk about their relationship to disability, because it'll influence how the rest of the company acts. Because everyone's acting based on how they assume the head of the company wants them to act without really knowing them. And storytelling allows for that vulnerability and those conversations to happen. And that also translates into the casting environment of where I work. Unfortunately, as an assistant at a television studio, not many people are willing to listen to me, even though I became the subject matter expert in that disability representation and how it was talked about in television scripts. But when I would make suggestions on how things should be changed or how we should alter the casting process for a specific project to be more inclusive of people with disabilities, a lot of the higher ups in casting weren't willing to talk to the writers or producers to make that change because they were too fearful that they were going to be ruining the creativity of the project. But that's not how things get done. And fortunately, there have been a lot of years of other people like me trying to convince people to work differently. And we've seen some better things happening more recently. But at that point in time, I just felt frustrated and defeated after about a year of trying to advocate for more inclusion of people in the roles that were described as a wheelchair user or little person. Like, at least try to find them, and they're out there. And every actor, every person is given a chance by someone who believes in them and is willing to give them that first shot. And that's how recognition happens. So after a year of working there, I decided to kind of hang my coat up in Los Angeles and move back to the Boston area. It was not an easy decision. I felt kind of defeated, even in the environment that I was in. There was one person who wanted me there, one person who did not, and I had to work for both people at the same time. So I was kind of pushed out the door. It felt like a mentally draining low point in my life, just because I had tried so hard to get my foot in the door in a very competitive city, cutthroat. A lot of people talk about how the conversations are, what can you do for me, rather than what can we do to help each other. That's just how the mentality was there. And I just was not feeling the support I needed. So I moved back to the Boston area. My sister was a creative writing teacher in middle school at the time, and she said that she was so excited for me to move back. She had missed me and really wanted to hang out more often. And one of the ways to do that could be going to speak to her students, share my story. And I thought, I was only an assistant in Hollywood. Who really wants to hear my story? And she convinced me that people do want to hear my story, regardless of what level I was in my career. I was actually speaking at another organization a few weeks back, and the CEO made a point to stop me and say, "You're the CEO of your life. Like, you can decide where you are, at what level you are, and people will listen to you if you feel confident about that in that position." And I was able to find a niche in going to different schools after speaking to my sister's students, going to different schools where there was someone with a disability transitioning from elementary to middle school or middle to high school. And they were going to meet a whole new group of people, whether they can control it or not. Even if you're in the same grade with people, you're going to meet new people as schools become bigger during the older years. And some families can't control whether they have to move for a job to a different major city or small town. And I was able to, and I continued to go into schools, talk about the accommodations I had growing up, with hopes that the administrators listen to the student. Maybe they don't want the same accommodations I had, but they are some options. And also making sure that people aren't just pigeonholed into a special education plan that doesn't make sense for them. There was one student who has dwarfism, and she was definitely in the wrong school. And fortunately, we were able to work together with the administrators and her parents to get her back in the mainstream school. Because at the end of the day, in our adult life, we're with all of the people in this world together, and we need to find ways to adapt. So I'm very big into advocating for that integrated approach of making sure people are included in all parts of the education process. It was clear that I wasn't going to be on the basketball team, and it wasn't something that I pursued, but I was able to be on the youth soccer team, sailing, swimming. So with swimming that I participated in from preschool on to high school, I was on the high school swim team. I had some accommodations that made it feel a little bit more like I was part of the team and able to compete. When we were doing 50-yard laps in a competitive race, I only needed to do 25. So then I would finish a little closer to when my peers would finish. And it really is up to the person, because someone may not want that because they may think it is cheating or not the right way to approach things. But for me, it was feeling like I was competing on a little bit closer of a level. So it's really up to the person on their preference. But these are the things I would talk about when I was speaking to those schools. I was also asked to go speak to an organization of little people that was forming in Nairobi, Kenya. This was back in 2013. And the reason that the organization needed to form, they needed to become a formal organization, because there were some people with dwarfism in Kenya who wanted to come to Michigan back in 2012 for this thing called the World Dwarf Games. And the country of Kenya and the people involved in helping make that happen did not want to support that travel because there wasn't a formal organization. So there was a motivated group of people in Nairobi, Kenya, who got together a nonprofit organization to support people with dwarfism. And they asked me to come be a keynote speaker. It was an eye-opening experience. I was very appreciative at how grateful all these people were, how happy they seemed when they were together, even though there are so few resources there. But one thing about having so few resources in their situation was that there were fewer layers. They had a good relationship with the president of Kenya. They had a good relationship with the senator, who was like the head of their board of directors. So they were able to get their voice heard because there were fewer layers to get that recognition and support that they needed. And it also took eager people who worked hard to get that recognition. And the organization continues to exist now. I was excited to be part of their launch, see all that was happening. Unfortunately, just the medical care, dental care, there's just so few resources, especially when it comes to specialists. You're basically assigned to the medical specialist who is assigned to your village where you live, and you don't know what their specialty may be. It was a great experience. At this point, when I got back from Kenya, I had been living at home with my parents for 1.5 years, trying to get the speaking off the ground, a lot of great opportunities, but not enough to really feel like I was making a true living, or it was really starting to take a burden on my eagerness for independence, since I had lived across the country and was independent there. So I ended up getting recruited to work at the Actors Union in New York, the SAG-AFTRA, which is the Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. I worked specifically in the diversity department, where we advocated for all areas of diversity. And one of the areas was disability and the Performers with Disabilities Committee. So I was trying to help promote more representation of disability and then all the other demographics. One of the challenges I faced while working at SAG-AFTRA, I was at the coordinator level, but I worked really hard, and I was living in New York City. The pay wasn't great, but I was trying to figure out how to make it work. My boss advocated for a promotion for me, but his boss kind of turned it down, and it became really frustrating because I was just going to be in the same position if I stayed there. And it was about 3.5 years until I was given an opportunity to work for another organization where we advocate on behalf of disability inclusion in the workplace, specifically, not specific to entertainment, but there are some entertainment companies that are involved. And it was important for me to make that transition because it was also a disability-specific organization, and a desire that I had was to be promoted in a workplace, be able to get to that next level after working really hard and not wanting to wait around until someone was okay with me getting to that next level. So after about 1 year working for the organization, I was promoted from manager to director, and just really excited to kind of be at a place where I feel included and a part of an important initiative specific to disability, which is also my lived experience that I can speak to the most. So another thing that kind of happened around that time was, personally, I was in a long distance relationship. This job was remote, so I moved out of New York City. I moved to Wisconsin, where my husband was living at the time. And after about 2 years, we got married, and I was able to kind of carry the job with me and also carry the speaking. And it's something that works for my lifestyle because now we have a child and he also has dwarfism, and it makes the work that we do even more important because I want to make sure that he doesn't have barriers when he's entering the workplace. And hopefully, if there are barriers, he can learn about kind of the challenges, and that the people on the other side are going to be a little more open to giving him the feedback he needs to learn and grow. So a lot of things that I try to encourage employers to do is be as inclusive as possible by being open to suggestions and feedback on both sides of things. Don't hold grudges and be fearful of how you approach disability in the past. People who teach about disability inclusion want to help you get better for the future. So you may want to have a conversation with someone like me about maybe how you approach something in the past and you want to handle it a little differently in the future. But you don't need to be so hard on yourself because you didn't know. You won't know until you learn from someone like me how to be better. A lot of times parents may ask me, how do I teach my child about interacting with someone with a disability? When we're out in public, there are sometimes moments where a parent may pull their child aside and say, don't point, stare, or laugh at that person, but it's kind of a part of their curiosity and they just want to know why I'm different. And I would encourage you to have your child come up to me and ask a question. Other people may say, oh, but what if the person we see is not as approachable as you are? You don't know if that person's not approachable unless you go and try. And they could just be having a bad day like everyone else, but you miss out on opportunity if you don't try. Pulling your child towards you to ignore the difference is more harmful. And then it's also harmful if an adult points their child to say, hey, look over there. Those are some moments that happen too, which are unfortunate. So sometimes the students, the children, are learning things in school to be more inclusive and accepting, and they can teach the adults something. So it's really important to have open, honest conversations, but allow your children and yourselves to be curious. I say, no questions offensive to me, so ask me anything you want, because it'll help us learn and grow together. When it comes to allowing people to enter your workforce, have touch points everywhere possible, lines where it says, if you need an accommodation, let us know. And in most cases, people won't take you up on it. But in other cases, those who take you up on it will feel more comfortable to have those conversations because you're putting it out there first. So this is early on in the application process, the interview process, and then onboarding, and even having an internal portal that has a sentence about accommodations once someone's an employee. And you want to make sure you don't celebrate hiring more people with disabilities at the main level or in internships. You want to also figure out how you can help them learn and grow, retain and advance, because people with disabilities are known to stay at companies for longer than they need to or may want to because they're loyal workers, but they also deserve that loyalty in return. And then there's also a whole side of things. There are people with disabilities who want to be entrepreneurs and want to start their own businesses, and they can get certified as businesses of choice for people with disabilities. And you want to make sure that you encourage spend with those types of businesses that are owned by people with disabilities, because most likely they are hiring people with disabilities. And when we talk about disabilities in general, we want to keep the definition as broad as possible, but I think a lot of people's minds go to just one specific type of disability. There may be one program related to including people with the intellectual and developmental disabilities at a company, and they may think that that's the only work that needs to be done. But it's important to open your doors of opportunity to all different types of disabilities, and there are all different roles that people can play. And then it's being honest. If there isn't a job opening, you don't need to force one, but if there is an opportunity to create a space that someone with a disability could excel in, you should feel encouraged to do that. And I just want to say, anyone in this room, I'm not sure who may identify as having a visible or non-visible disability or relationship to disability, can become part of the disability family at any point. And it's not something to be fearful of, because it's a community of people who are learning to adapt to life in different ways. And we don't want people to feel bad for us. We just want people to give us a chance to participate in a meaningful way in society and in the workplace specifically, because it allows people to get the independence they want to live a fulfilling life. So I'm going to pass it back to Sanjina. I'd love to just take any questions that people have.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Becky, for sharing your story. It's very, very inspirational. Lots and lots of best practices. So I'm just going to go through some of I've been taking notes, and we'll make sure that you receive this as a follow-up, in an email to share it with your colleagues and have some tangible takeaways. While I'm doing that, if any other question come to your mind, anything that, like Becky said, she's very open, no off limits, right, Becky? And so that's one of the things that doesn't allow us to grow is sometimes we fear that, I may ask the wrong question. I may not say it right. Okay. And so this is why we're creating this space. If we keep staying in that space of being fearful, we will never learn. So this is why we're hosting these conversations. This is why these are intimate small group conversations where we have to ask these questions. Otherwise, we will not know. We don't know what we don't know, right? And so this is your opportunity. So in terms of best practices, here are some of the things I jotted down. Becky initially talked about parent advocacy. Advocacy can come in lots of different ways. I encourage each one of you to think about, no matter what seat you are in, no matter where you are in an organization, how can you be that advocate and how can you be that ally? But Becky talked about having an ally throughout her life, which is very helpful. every single marginalized person needs an ally. What does it mean to be an ally? What does it mean to be? I encourage you to think of being an active ally. Just saying I'm an ally is not enough. Think about what makes you an ally. What is 1, 2, 3 things that you've done that actually makes you an ally? How do you advocate and how do you show up for them? Just by making a social media post, I support this and I support that, doesn't really make people allies. It has to be an active form. It has to be an action-oriented form. So I encourage you to think about how you are being that active ally. I think one of the things that Becky said really struck on me, which as a person of color, as an immigrant, as a person of marginalized identity, I also feel this way, which the world isn't made the same for everyone. So I encourage all of you to think about, no matter where you're in, what space you are, who is this created for, and who is feeling that this is not created for them? How can we be inclusive to those individuals who don't feel like this space, this work, this office, this anything that we're involved in is not made for them? Please, we need to think about, how, because that's the hard work of inclusion. We talk about diversity, inclusion. That is the hard work of inclusion, to really think about who is feeling outside of the margins. In our job applications, who are not seeing themselves. In our interview process, who are feeling discriminated, right? I think that's something that I took away from what Becky said. The world wasn't made. We don't think about these every day. Like everything is higher for somebody like Becky. How can we make some accommodations? How can we think about it? How can we think about people who are visually impaired or hard of hearing or any other marginalized identity, that they are able to access the same level of services, products and services that we're here to offer? Think about English language skills. I think this world was not, especially the US, was not made for people who are not fluent in American English. I may be fluent in, Asian accent English, but still I'm expected to be an American English speaker. So think about how that affects folks. I think she talked about she touched a lot on the perception and how we can positively or negatively and accidentally portray different people, different groups. And so what space do we have? What responsibility do we have? What influence do we have to create that positive perception for people with marginalized identities? She did talk about interview process and in best practices around job descriptions. Becky, maybe if you have a few specific tips, would love to hear from them. I think I heard you say, talk about your inclusion strategy. Talk about we are a welcoming space. Talk about, that we welcome people of all backgrounds, whatever that may be. That tells people that, hey, they're aware that, it's not going to be the same type of people and they don't expect a certain type of people to come and apply. And then she talked about really the power of coaches, mentors, and sponsors. People of marginalized identities usually are not going to advance in an organization without the support of, no matter how brilliant we may be, we may have perfect IQ, we may have perfect everything, but without the support of mentors, coaches, and sponsors, it's very difficult for people to advance. And so think about how you can be that no matter where you're sitting in an organization. Do I need to pause, Becky? Is there anything you want to add? I have a couple more other best practices, then I will go to the chat questions.
Yeah, just with the job description process, when you're asking about that question, an obvious one is a lot of companies, just by using a template that maybe is an old template, may put in a job requirement like must lift a 50-pound box. It may be challenging for someone with a physical disability, so that's a potential barrier. Is it something that one person somewhere else in the office can do once in a great while? Like, is it really a requirement of the job? If it really is, it's important to keep it in there, but really think about all those descriptions to make sure there aren't any barriers preventing someone with a disability to apply if it's a job that they could actually do. And then it's also up to the candidate to say that they can do these things that are described in your honest job description.
Yep, great tip. Thank you. I really appreciate you talking about how top level people have to speak about their relationship with disability. In our DEI world, in my DEI world, I always say that helps leaders be authentic leaders. A lot of times, leaders, and I also say that, in the past, CEOs and leaders could just balance books and would be good CEOs and good leaders. And now a lot more is expected of leaders. A lot more is expected of our CEOs. And so it just talking authentically about, their relationship with diversity, period. It could be all kinds of diversity. I think it really makes them authentic and real, and it allows other people to follow, I guess, right? So I really appreciate it.
Once people start sharing their stories with us and their relationship to disability or diversity, just a layer just drops down and you feel closer in that connection to someone, that the empathy levels are high and they're willing to accommodate whatever needs you may have.
Yeah. I also really liked what you talked about, not to be fearful. And I think I always say choose curiosity over judgment. And so being curious, and people are afraid to ask lots of different people, other diversity too, right? They don't know how to ask, like, I'm really curious about your family history. Like, I'm not trying to be a racist, but I don't know how to ask. Like, there's a certain way to ask, where are you really from, right? But choose curiosity over judgment, and being fearful is just not going to help us grow. So I think those were some of the best practices that I took away.
And just
Becky,
kind of reading off of that a little bit is approach someone and talk to them by their given name. And then as you start to have a dialogue and you feel more comfortable with each other, some of those harder questions are going to be easier to ask, and really intentionally think about what you're trying to get at when you're asking those questions. But that person can push back and say, you know what, like, you may be asking too much. So it is a two-sided conversation, and it's really important to address someone by their name and make them feel comfortable, and then they'll feel more comfortable opening up to you about their difference.
So I'll take a pause there, and I know there's one question in the chat that I will start with, but I would love for folks to unmute and ask questions and interact with our keynote speaker today, if you feel compelled to do so. One of the questions in the chat, Becky, it says, what are some longer term workforce issues, challenges your community has faced that continue to need solutions, support, or resolutions?
Well, I think specific to, I guess, the dwarfism versus disability community, in both, one of the challenges with the dwarfism community is that some people think they have a disability and some people don't think. So it's hard to figure out where we fit into the equation and the puzzle pieces sometimes. And sometimes on the employer end as well, they may assume that we're not part of the disability community, but where do we fit in? So a lot of the accommodations and issues that come to play for dwarfism specifically are just acceptance in general and willing to give us a chance, even if we can't reach things, willing to accommodate with a step stool, the very few accommodations we may need. And then with the disability community as a whole, I think we continue to face challenges in the retention and advancement area, and allowing people with disabilities to grow within a company and have seats at the table at the board level. We're seeing a lot of support through NASDAQ and the SEC around women and people of color and making sure that representation exists, but there's still pushback when it comes to disability. A lot of organizations, when they're starting their diversity efforts, they may focus on women and people of color, and they're not quite ready to focus on disability yet. But if you're going to start these efforts, you might as well make sure you're focusing on everything in order for it to be true inclusion. So I think there's just that pushback. And then an area that continues to be a struggle for companies to really spend enough time and money in is digital accessibility. When companies are outward facing, they're willing to do whatever they can to accommodate their customers. So in most cases, companies' websites that are external facing are more accessible than those internal facing. but then that's a barrier to employment for someone who may need those internal accessibility tools. And that person may also be the person who can provide the solutions to the customers and the internal staff. So it's important to be open to really making sure you're thinking about all your websites and not just one area, because that's what generates the most money. And then I would just say in general, the community still is, the unemployment rate is twice that of those without disabilities. And the COVID pandemic has made it even worse for people with disabilities. But we're also in a pivotal moment where it's been proven that people can be successful working remotely. And this is something that people with disabilities have been asking to do for years, and that accommodation wasn't given. And then when we were all put in this scenario, because of a pandemic, we've learned that people can be productive and successful, and they don't have to worry about that grueling commute that may prevent them from showing up to work on time. There may be transportation issues or weather delays that may make someone feel more panicked if they get to an office late. And then it's also another way that an employer may feel they can punish someone if they're not able to get there on time. So having the accommodation of working remotely allows someone to be able to show up and perform at their best in their comfortable environment. So hopefully we can continue to see more of that. But there are going to be people, when everyone does go back physically, I know some people are already back in their offices, but there are people who do want to physically go back because they do feel isolated and want to have that camaraderie of being physically in the office. So it's important to not just compartmentalize disability or accommodations for people with disabilities. It's being open to each person's individual preference and experience.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really great point. Thanks for touching on that. There are several articles out there lately that talks about inclusion of the people with disability and how the remote work and hybrid work has opened, new doors for employers. So if you haven't already as an employer, I think this is a great opportunity to tap into that market. And this is exactly the reason why we at the Greater Des Moines Partnership are trying to socialize this concept of untapped talent. We know there's large pools of talent in certain groups that are underutilized historically. And as the war for talent continues, as the population is shrinking, every single sector in workforce is having worker shortages. We are encouraging employers to look into these untapped pools of talent that haven't really been tapped into. People with disabilities, absolutely one of them. African Americans, people with who are incarcerated, refugees, immigrants, veterans. These are other groups. LGBTQ Americans. These are other groups, and employers have to really look into creatively tapping into these pools where usually when we say there's a low unemployment rate for the general population, there's always a high unemployment rate among persons with disabilities, right? And so how do you build, one of the things that we suggest, Becky, is for employers to build relationship with local nonprofits who provide support to those individuals. Can you talk a little bit about what other suggestions you have in other maybe national nonprofits that people can tap into? And maybe if you want to touch a little bit on your work with the Disability Index,
yes,
that would be awesome.
So one thing that's really important is to make sure that you're thinking about all different types of disabilities. So there are all different types of nonprofit organizations that represent different types of disabilities. So it's important to not just focus on one type of disability and have that be your one and only nonprofit relationship. So there's organizations like Little People of America, Best Buddies. There's American Association of People with Disabilities, which is kind of a conglomerate of all different types of disabilities. So it's good to look at those bigger picture, larger organizations as well. And they're actually the organization that's a partnership that created this index called the Disability Equality Index, which is a benchmarking tool that allows companies to self-assess what they're doing when it comes to disability inclusion across the enterprise. If you go to disabilityequalityindex.org, you can download the questions and start applying them to your organizations right away. What is one of the things that people do in the area of community engagement, is engaging with the community about the products and services that you're developing to get the community's feedback. Because there may be something that you're offering that could be really helpful to the wheelchair user community, but maybe not helpful to the dwarfism community. Doesn't mean you shouldn't release that product. You just want to get feedback from different parties. And one of the reasons why I use that example is we do a lot of work with Married International, where we go and have conversations across disability organizations to talk about the business traveler experience for people with disabilities. It's not just about having an ADA accessible hotel room and a standard hotel room. There are some things that work for some people in an accessible hotel room, but some may want a standard hotel room with just a few tweaks and accommodations. So for me, I prefer to have a standard hotel room with a step stool that I can use to reach the sink in the bathroom and the bed. If someone else is coming as a wheelchair user, they may prefer the ADA accessible room, but it is different across different types of disabilities, and it can't be assumed that one person wants one or the other. So with the index and the work that we do, it's really just encouraging companies to think about everything that helps them become more inclusive and attract people with disabilities in their workplace and outside of their workplace as customers. And with the index data and research that we were able to put together the first 4 years of the index, 2015 to 2018, we really drilled down the data. This is Fortune 1000 companies and entities that are non-government that have 500 employees or more that are self-assessing what they're doing across their enterprise. And with the research from the Disability Equality Index data, we are able to find out that companies who are invested in this work do perform better financially, and it's a good return on investment, and people with disabilities need to continue to be included in the workplace.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Many of you might be aware with the Human Rights Campaign that does similar benchmarking for LGBTQ friendliness and welcoming. So there is such a thing for disability employment as well. And so I put the link on the chat. We'll make sure that you get it as a follow-up as well. So that's a really great tool to start assessing and looking at what kinds of things do we need to look into to be a disability-friendly and inclusive employer. What Becky, also talked about in her remarks earlier, that sometimes people ask me, Becky, how can I make sure that the job description, tells people that we want them? Should I be putting, sentences around we encourage people of blah, blah, blah to apply? And I say, yes, you should absolutely do that, because that tells people of marginalized identities that you want them, that you are friendly to them, that you are thinking about it, that you are doing something around inclusion of all kinds of people in the organization. And nobody has reached the destination. Nobody's perfect, but at least it's an indication that we're aware and we're doing something around it, right?
Absolutely.
What other questions do you have for Becky?
Becky, I'll jump in. First of all, thank you so much for your comments today and your candor. It's so refreshing to hear from someone who's just being very open and making it okay for us to ask questions that maybe we're feeling a little vulnerable about. So thank you for that. And with that, I will ask my question that is a mom question. So you had mentioned that at times some people experience that their kiddos around will point, laugh, and then the parent will pull them away and tell them not to do that. Would love your advice for parents on how do we handle a situation if our kiddos who are maybe too young to truly understand, how do we help them and make sure that we're treating those individuals with potentially more visible disabilities with respect and honoring who they are as human beings?
That's a great question. I think one of the struggles is it really depends on the scenario. It's like, say you're on an escalator and that person's going down and you're going up and you're with your kid and they say something like, there's not enough time to be able to interact with that person. But if you are like on the same level and there's a little bit extra time to be able to interact, as a parent, you could kind of start the conversation to be like, hi, how are you? My child would like to ask you a question. And in more cases than not, I would think that the person would be receptive to that. I think with the quick moment on the escalator, or just any example kind of like that, where you're just ships passing in a storm, it would be better if you allow your child to do whatever they want to do and you not shunning them in front of the person. Like, I think it would feel really awkward for me if the parent interjected and tried to be like, don't do that, don't, like, I would rather the child just continue to say whatever they're saying, because at the end of the day, we know they're a child and they're just curious, they're wondering why we're different. But I think it's once that parent steps in and says, don't do that, then you're like, how are they going to learn? Like, they're really just kind of expressing their curiosity. But it may be beneficial if there's those quick moments for you to then go home, and because the internet has so many great resources, probably try to find trustworthy resources like the nonprofit organizations related to that type of disability, and find a few facts that you can then kind of talk to your child about. See if there are maybe any children's books related to that type of disability, just to kind of allow them to become more familiar. So then when they have that next interaction, they won't be as fearful, and maybe they'll be more empowered to go and ask a question, if that helps. But I think it's really that interjection. Like, if we observe you interjecting to be like, don't do that, don't look that way, or it's more harmful than allowing your child just to be.
Awesome advice, awesome question. We all deal with that. Sometimes we run into people in the elevator, honestly, and we get frozen. I don't know how many of you have experienced that. We get frozen. Should I say something? Should I act like I didn't see you? Should I say hello, right? I think everybody, all of you, I'm sure, have run into those situations. And I think a good response is to act normal, right, Becky? But just interact. What would you say to another person if it wasn't in a wheelchair? How is your day going? Where are you going? Can I help you with something? Whatever that is, right? One of the things I struggle with is we always feel like we have to help someone in a wheelchair or somebody with a physical disability. Tell us a little bit about that. What should be our natural instinct response?
I was just thinking about that. So I often use the example of being in a grocery store, being in an aisle where I know I need something, but it's on the top shelf. So sometimes I have to wait till I see someone who comes down the aisle to help me reach that thing on the top shelf. It's a lot more comfortable for me when someone comes up to me and offers to help, and then gives me some space to allow me to decide if I'm going to take you up on that offer. And I would say wheelchair users want the same thing, where they want someone to say, I'm here to help, but don't start pushing their chair or start reaching something for them without them giving you that additional permission. So it's putting it out there as much as possible that you're there if someone needs help. Sometimes it's more clear than not that someone's struggling and really needs help, and hopefully they'll take you up on the offer, but it's the personal choice of the individual. So it's a lot, same with that, like putting it out there that you're willing to make an accommodation for an interview. It's up to the individual to then ask for that. So it's important to put it out there, you're willing to help, and then the person can decide. But don't try to just do things for them right away, or it'll just make them more frustrated.
Any other consent is important in all situations? Absolutely, Steve.
Agreed.
Yes. Any other questions for Becky? If we don't have more questions, we could probably give you a few minutes back of your very important time today. But Becky, maybe it's the last. What should we go with today? from this Zoom room, one thing each individual can do today, tomorrow, every single day. How can we change the way we think? How can we be helpful in this world? What can we do? One thing maybe everybody can do as an individual.
That regardless of whether or not you think you have a disability, it's important to share your story with as many people who you feel comfortable with. Also seek out people with disabilities who maybe you wouldn't otherwise seek out, and you'll learn a lot.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for spending this time with us, Becky. I am a big fan of your work. Folks, if you haven't had a chance, go to her website. There's lots of videos, beckymotivates.com, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very fascinating. Becky also shared with me today. Becky, do you want to talk about that?
So I was just interviewed by Adweek in their Women Trailblazers section. So we'll attach that article to the follow-up email as well.
Awesome. Yes, thank you for that. We're continuing this conversation. This is not end all be all. This is the beginning of our conversation. Tomorrow we do have another webinar. It's going to be an experiential learning opportunity. If you had to pick a disability, what disability would you pick? We have some local, leaders with us from our Inclusion Council who will be leading that. And so if you haven't signed up, please do. If you have, great. We'll see you tomorrow. But with that, I'd like to really thank Becky for spending time with us, and all of you for spending this hour and 17 minutes with us. I hope you have some great takeaways with you. We'll be sharing this recording with you when it's available. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.